Now, if I started off here like I start off at the nursing home, I have to ask, are you having a good day? And they go, and then they go, why did you have lunch? Had lunch. I bet you had a good lunch. Yeah. Bless their hearts. Billy, thank you for the good prayer. Reminded me, and through the announcement as well. Next Sunday night, we're going to start a series of lessons just the month of March, on Sunday nights on prayer. And then the last Sunday night of the month, we will introduce our prayer ministry. It's a very simple ministry that we're going to have, and be thinking about if you'd like to participate. And you don't have to if you don't want to, and you may want to do your own thing, and that's fine. But if you want to participate, we'll be glad to share with you. And it's a ministry wherein even our folks that are listening over the telephone that are shut-ins, if they want to participate, if they'll call me when we get all this started, we'll be sure to give them names as well that they can be praying for. And so we'll explain it towards the end of the month, but invite your friends. Prayer, I don't know, each day as I get involved and get spend a little time in prayer, I just realize how important prayer is in my life. Now, maybe not so much in yours. I hope that it is, but it seems like each day it just gets a little stronger urge there. And so we want to talk about prayer and for a little while, at least in the month of March. I shared with you, I think, back probably a year and a half or so ago, story. I'll share it with you again because if you're like me, you've probably forgotten it by now. But I remember it very vividly because it happened. True story, happened to me. It was actually the first work that Suzanne and I was ever involved in full time after we got out of school. We had a couple that, when we knew them, they had grown children. Their boys were grown out of the house and were living their own life. But the husband and wife were fairly regular in coming to church. Matter of fact, his mother and father came to church and on a regular basis. And we grew to love them. And we were standing out. You'd have to understand the community. The community was very small, and it had one very large parking lot, and the 4 stores in the community were right there off that big parking lot. Small community. But we were standing there because there was a community event one Saturday evening. We were standing there talking to them. And he talked to me, and he told me about his sons. His sons had been in and out of trouble with the law because they were addicted and also selling for a period of time. And he told me as we continued to talk that evening, he said, "Preacher," he said, "you just really don't know what it's like not to want to get up in the morning." And I said, "Go further, explain." And he told me then about his boys. And he told me, he said, it just got to the point where it just seemed hopeless and there was no hope. It just seemed like there was nothing that I could do. There was nothing that could be done to break the cycle that these boys were going through. And he said, there were police coming and knocking at my door all hours of the day and night. My wife constantly stayed scared. It was just a terrible time. Well, that's true of life. Maybe you have been sitting in a doctor's office and he gives you some very bad news. Maybe you've been with a loved one and you've gotten bad news. I've sat with families that literally, when you're sitting there with them in the hospital and the doctor says there's nothing more we can do. And you think and you ask yourself, well, what if I had one more day? One more day. I know when my father passed away in 2006, I just made the statement. I told my mother, I said, if I had one more day and one more conversation. And my mother looked at me and she said, "You just want one more." And that's probably right. But have you ever thought about having just one more day? That's a great gift from God, isn't it? It's a rose. It's a beautiful thing that God gives us each day, a new day. One more day. Well, we've been studying the book of Acts this month, and hopefully you've kept up with your readings. If you hadn't, that's fine, but hopefully you have. And I want to talk about a reading that you'll occur tomorrow, actually. But if you've been keeping up your readings, you know that as we closed out this morning and talked about Felix, that Felix, after Paul had reasoned with him of righteousness and self-control and judgment to come, that Felix trembled and he said, when I have a more convenient season, I'll call for you. We talk about him being almost persuaded as we sing from time to time. And the fact is that as far as we know from a historical standpoint, Felix never found that opportune time, never found that right time to call Paul and say, hey, come back. I need to obey the gospel. Well, remember that Paul had been arrested and Paul had really been told by God, you're going to get to Rome. Paul wanted to get to Rome and God had said, you're going to get there. Now, he's arrested. He stands before Felix. Felix then kind of, as he says, you've almost persuaded me, he doesn't do anything with Paul. He really doesn't know what to do with Paul. And so in comes Festus to take Felix's place. Festus is also a procurator, and he decides and he knows what to do. And so, to make a long story short, because you know the story, Paul is going to go on ship to Rome. Now, God has reminded him that he's going to get to go. Now, all of a sudden, he's going to get to go, but yet it's not really a good time to set sail. The Lord tells him, no, there's going to be loss of life. It's not a good time. And so Paul tells the ship's crew, the captain, no, this is not a good time to leave. And, they being typical male, you know what they said? We're going to do it anyway. And so they did. And so they set sail. Well, the storms were terrible. And for 14 days, the crew didn't eat. For 14 days, the crew battled the storm. It got so bad, they finally threw the anchors overboard. They were trying to take weight off of the ship. And they thought about taking all the prisoners, Paul being one of them, and throw them off the ship. But there was one that said, no, Paul had found favor. Let's don't throw these prisoners off the ship. So then they took part of the mast and things of that nature, and they threw them overboard. Why? To lighten the ship, so that harm wouldn't come to them, and they could set easier and higher in the water. Paul, as they're facing what seems to be death, Paul reminds them and tells them, I told you we shouldn't have left. Now, you can read that one of two ways. You can read it as Paul went up and said, I told you we shouldn't have left. Or Paul went up to him and said, we shouldn't have left. But. And then he told them, he said, but my God's promised that we're going to get there without loss of life. It's going to be all right. Well, they still fight the storm. And eventually, they come upon what, for lack of a better term, a sandbar, breaks the ship into pieces, and they swim on shore. They get to the Isle of Malta. When they get there, they're cold, they're wet. There is a gathering of sticks for the fire. This is the story, remember there, where Paul then gathers the sticks and throws them into the fire, and out comes a serpent and grabs him. But he doesn't die. And all of the people want to call Paul a god because he doesn't swell up, he doesn't die. It's kind of interesting because when you read the 28th chapter, it's as the serpent grabs him, and then, of course, he shakes it off into the fire. And then the way I read it, the people just kind of sit back and they're just thinking, well, let's see how long this takes. Let's see how long it takes him to swell up. And let's see how long it takes him before he dies. And he doesn't. Well, all of that, as I was reading and studying it, I thought, if you just had one more day, what would you do? And some of the things we're going to talk about tonight maybe necessarily are not things that the text says that Paul did. But I believe that Paul was this type of man, and he probably did these things because Paul had one more day, at least, to live after the shipwreck. Now, admittedly, Paul is all right. Paul, in a matter of a few months, will set sail, and Paul eventually gets to Rome. And while Acts closes at this point, and what we might think of closes the history of Paul, it really doesn't. This is about 62 AD when you get to Acts 28. And Paul will live till about 68 AD. So Paul lives another 6 years after the close of the book of Acts. But Paul has another day. But what does he do with another day? What would you do with another day? If you were facing what seemed to be death, you were facing, okay, this ship's going to wreck, and what am I going to do if I'm given one more day? Well, can't you imagine Paul got off in Acts 28, and it doesn't say it in verse 1 and 2, but Paul got off and Paul kissed the ground. I mean, who wouldn't? Who wouldn't be thankful for what happened? It's now gone, and all of a sudden, we're all right. If you've ever had anything bad happen to you, anything bad be diagnosed for you, you know that when it all changes course, and when it goes back to, if you will, normal, that then you almost, if not literally, get down on your knees and you thank God for the time you have. Thank God that you're able to see a new day. In most of my prayers in the mornings, before I ever crawl out of bed, I thank God that He's allowed me to rise to see a new day. And I just think that that's important to thank God, to thank Him for what you have. You see, it's important that we have a grateful heart. A grateful heart really comes out of a good attitude, doesn't it? You know, if you have an attitude that is happy, an attitude that is thankful, you look on the good side of life. If you're grumpy and you just everything, you complain about everything and nothing satisfies you and nothing makes you happy, then your attitude affects everything about you. You don't see the good in life. You see the problems. You see the bad. You see the potholes. You don't see the road. Of course, right now, the road is one big pothole. I understand that if you drive down the interstate. But at the same point in time, too, you understand what I'm saying. That while a man, as he thinks in his heart so easy, we're told in Proverbs 23, we're told in Proverbs 4 to keep his heart with all diligence. For out of it come the issues of life. You see, attitude affects the way we live our life. Paul was, I'm sure, grateful. Oh, he could have looked at it and he could have said, you know, I'm not happy. But Jesus reminds us in Matthew 7 that we're not to judge. Judge not, that you be not judged, but with what judgment you judge, it should be judged. With what measure you meet, it should be measured unto you again. You might say, well, what does that have to do with attitude? Well, if you have a judgmental attitude, you're judging all of a sudden. Well, God, why did you give me this day? Why did I have to go through all of that? Why did I go through those difficulties? Why did I go through those dark days? Why did I go through those storms? Why did I go through? And you've missed the point. Paul, if you stop and think about his writings that would have occurred after the book of Acts, most notably 1st, 2nd Timothy, and Titus, Paul doesn't keep referring back to, well, you know, I almost died. And you know, God put me through this, and God let all this happen to me, and all of this was bad. That was never Paul's attitude. Paul, in his thorn in the flesh, we often talk about it in 2 Corinthians, the 12th chapter. But if you go back to 2 Corinthians, the 11th chapter, Paul talks about all that he went through. And Paul even looks at his thorn in the flesh as being a humbling experience that helped him. Because he said, lest I should be exalted above measure through the abundance of revelation that was given to me. A thorn in the flesh. Paul said it was a humbling experience. It taught me something. It taught me to be the person what? A person that was thankful. A person that looked on the good side of what was happening. Man one time was moving. And his moving truck, his U-Haul, needed gas. And so he stopped at a gas station at a community that wasn't very far from the community he was moving to. And there was an old man out there by the pump, and so the man, as he was filling up the truck, he said, hey, tell me about the people in the next town. He said, what kind of people are they? And the old man looked at him and he said, well, let me ask you this. He said, what kind of people were in the community in which you're coming from? He said, oh man, they were nice. He said, I loved them. I cherished them. They were like family. I'm having to move because of my work. And I really, I didn't want to move. And the old man looked at him and he says, that's the same that you'll find where you're going. Well, how are you able to tell me that? The old man looked at him and he says, because of attitude. Attitude. Paul's attitude, I'm sure, was grateful. While we put away certain things in our life, we put away bitterness and anger, wrath and clamor and evil speaking. Ephesians 4, verse 31, we're reminded to be kind, tenderhearted, forgiving one another. Verse 32. The admonition then is to do what? To rejoice, to give thanks to the Lord, for he is good. Psalm 118, verse 1. For this is the day that the Lord has made. We will rejoice and be glad in it. Psalm 118, verse 24. We need to learn to be thankful for what we have, thankful for what we're given. After all, Daniel said in Daniel chapter 5, verse 34, that God holds within his hand our very breath. Story is told of back many years ago of an old farmer that had a lot of hands that worked for him and with him. The wife of the old farmer always felt bad that these workers were working in the heat of the day out in the fields. And so every day at lunch, she would prepare a very large lunch. She'd get up very early and she'd cook breakfast for her family as she sent them out. And then she'd cook a large lunch, not just for her family, but for all the workers as well. And so as she cooked the meals, she would watch the people as they would come in. And they would come in and they would eat. One day when they came in and there at each of their plates was a big old plate of hay and oats. Some of them thought, what in the world? Has she lost her mind? Why is she doing this? This is a practical joke, some even said. And she said, no, I've watched you all for weeks now. I've sweated, I've toiled in the kitchen to prepare you meals. She said, never once have you told me thank you, and never once have you bowed your head to thank God for what has been placed before you. And so I was trying to give you what you deserve. Well, maybe we need to be mindful that if we have one more day, be thankful. Be thankful for what we have. But then second of all, be a blessing to others if you have one more day. Look in verse 3 of Acts chapter 28, and what do you find? You find an interesting point. You find that it says that when Paul had gathered the bundle of sticks together. You see, Paul didn't sit on the shore and say, oh, me, look what's happened. He didn't sit on the shore and say, hey, there's other people around. By the way, he says the people at Malta were great. He thought they were tremendous people. But now all of a sudden he's sitting there, he's wet, he's cold, he's been on the ship, they haven't eaten in a couple of weeks, and he's cold, he's tired. He knows that he's a prisoner, that he's not going to get to go anywhere or do anything, but he also knows as well that, well, just let them wait on me, but that's not Paul. That's not the way Paul acted. That's not the life that Paul had. You see, Paul was trying to be a blessing. The fire would not only warm him, but it would warm all that would stand around him. And so he was willing to serve. We've been called by God to be servants, haven't we? That whosoever be great among you, let him be your servant. Matthew chapter 20 and verse 28. The idea of being a servant is not one of those attitudes and ideas that we would put high on our list and say, yeah, man, I want to be a servant. But that's what God calls us to. In Romans chapter 6 and verse 17, he talks about God be thanked that you were the servants of sin, but you have obeyed from the heart that form of doctrine which is able to save you. And then he tells us in verse 18 to be servants. Serve God. To roll up our sleeves from time to time and be workers. To do what we can. You know, the only limit we have is what our abilities will allow. And sometimes we have to talk ourselves into it, admittedly. You know, it's not always fun to call up someone, especially if they're sick, to put a smile on their face. You've heard me say this, and it is true, that when I call anyone that's sick or anyone that's shut in that conversation, somewhere in that conversation, I want to make them laugh. I want to make them smile. I want to put a smile on their face. I want to get them to not think about what it is that's going on in their life that's the problem, but I want them to think about something pleasant. Now, it doesn't have to be the whole conversation. Yes, there's going to be a serious time, and yes, there's going to be a time in which maybe they're going to say, you know, I need a preacher, I need a counselor, I need someone to talk to, and there'll be those conversations. But somewhere in there has to be a lighthearted moment. That's part of being a servant. Let me roll up my sleeves and let me see what I can do for you. What can I do? How can I help you? How can I be of assistance to you? Jesus reminds us, if any man serves me, let him follow me. Doesn't that make sense? You might say, well, it seems to me that the chronology of the statement there in John 12, verse 26, is just backwards to what I think. You see, my thinking is that first of all, I'm going to follow the Lord, and then in following the Lord, I'm going to serve him. Jesus says, no, if you choose me, you're going to serve me, and if you serve me, you're going to follow me. And if you serve me, you're definitely going to find out what I need done. Now, while Jesus didn't come to be served, he came to serve. And we're reminded of that in Matthew 20, that Jesus came to be a servant. We've been called then to roll up our sleeves, to serve. Think about the verses. As I was going through my file this week to think about the idea of service and see some of the things that I had, I came across a note of a story years ago when I was preaching at Pomona. I preached a very lengthy series of sermons on, you thought I was going to say sermon. Some of you are already smiling. Lengthy sermon, that's just your sermon, Paul. No. This is a series of sermons on servants and service. And I'll call her name. She's passed away. Sweet little Miss Louise Beasley. Suzanne, remember Miss Louise? She wasn't but about that tall. She was a little crooked over from life. She had been a servant of the Lord for years. She was probably in her 90s. She had been in church all of her life. Every time the doors were open, she was there. And she came out and she said, you know, Brother Paul, she said, I hadn't thought about it till you've been preaching this series. And she said, I didn't realize there were so many verses in the Bible on service and serving others. Yeah, there are. Well, that's what God calls us to. We have opportunity. Let's do good unto all men. That should be our motto. Philippians chapter 2, verse 3 and 4. While we do nothing by, if you will, selfish ambition or conceit, we're to esteem others better than ourselves. We're to look upon others and see how we can help others. Paul exemplified that. In the book of Philippians chapter 2, verse 17, Paul said, if I be poured out as a drink offering, I rejoice. In other words, you'd have to go back. Paul is using sort of a Jewish idea that he would have had in his life at that point in time. But it was the idea of a drink offering. Now, there were several different type offerings. When we think of Old Testament offerings, we think of bringing an animal, and you have the priest to basically to gut it and to lay it up there and to have a sacrifice before God, to burn it completely. But there were other offerings. And there was a drink offering. And Paul said, he says, I can be poured out as a drink offering for you. I could be given in service for you and to you. What a great thought. And so in our lives, we really need to be people that if we yet another day, what can we do? How can we bless others? Let me illustrate it this way. There was a man one time. He was retired. He lived in Los Angeles. His name was Jerry. Jerry was a guy that, let's just put it bluntly, he was a little different. Jerry decided one day that he wanted to fly because he'd always wanted to fly, but he had never flown from the standpoint of being a pilot. He always wanted to be a pilot. He even lived close to the airport. Wanted to be a pilot, but he never was. One day he came up with a brilliant idea. So he went out and he bought a bunch of weather balloons. He filled them up with helium so that they would float. And he tied them to his lawn chair. Strapped himself in the lawn chair and laid in his lap a BB gun. Thought, I'll cut this anchor rope, I'll float up a little bit, I'll shoot the balloons out, I'll land on the ground. Everything will be all right. The only problem was that when Jerry cut the anchor cord, he didn't realize he had put a whole lot of weather balloons on the chair. And 11,000 feet. There was a plane that radioed into the tower in Los Angeles. We have a man in a chair with a gun in his lap at 11,000 feet. Well, they called some authorities in with a helicopter, and they were eventually able to get him back down to the ground. Because you see, when he got up to 11,000 feet, they asked him later on, a reporter asked him, he said, well, when I got up to 11,000 feet, he said, of course, he didn't know how high he was. He said, I was too scared to start shooting because I didn't want to come down all that way. But then the reporter asked him, said, why'd you do it? Oh, Jerry, he just smiled and he said, hey, a fellow just can't sit around and do nothing all of his life. Well, that's true in life. You can't just sit around and do nothing. Each day is a blessing. Bless others with it. Next, if you're given another day, trust in the Lord. That's what Paul did. Matter of fact, if you go back to the 27th chapter, and you look in verse 25, when he goes and tells those of the ship that they're going to get to Rome, he says, we're going to get there. There's not going to be loss of life. Everything's going to be all right. He says, and I believe God that it will be even as he has told me. Boy, that's a precious thought, isn't it? I believe God. I believe that it will be just like God taught me. To put your faith and trust in God. We put our faith and trust in a lot of things and a lot of people through life, don't we? When you drive in Nashville, you trust those people that are driving around you. And you've probably called a lot of them names that, well, they're not bad names, but we just don't use them in church. Stupid, idiot, ignorant, those, those things, those words that my mama said don't use. You think those things, right? But you put trust in those people that they're going to abide by the rules of the road. They're going to drive the speed limit. They're going to drive in their lane. They're going to, they're going to stop when they need to stop. They're going to go when they need to go. By the way, as soon as the light turns green, if you're a wife, you don't have to holler at your husband, go! That was directed. Suzanne does not help me drive anymore. When we were teenagers, she sat right beside me and helped me drive, but not anymore. I got so excited I flipped ahead. But we trust. We trust in a lot of other things. We trust in philosophies and philosophers. There's a lot of folks out there when you talk to them, a lot of what we will call 20 and 30-year-olds especially, that when you talk to them, they're living by a code, but it's far different than the code that we live by because their code is some philosopher, some teacher, some philosopher that has written a book or two or three or four or five, and they have eaten up. And they've put their trust in the philosophers. Some put their faith only in money. Some put their faith only in people. Some put their faith only in things. Cindy is her name, and I won't go any further than that, but Cindy was her name. She was a young lady that had wonderful, wonderful parents. They're I haven't talked to them in many years, but they're wonderful people. Cindy had gotten married. Sadly, it had not worked out. Cindy was away from home, and she was bound and determined that she was going to make it on her own. The bills were more than the income. She had decided to go back to college, to get a degree, to do something that she wanted to do that she thought was worthwhile. She was getting further and further and further in debt. Her parents did not have a lot of money, but what they had 3 girls altogether. But what they had, they were willing to help her with everything they could. The thing that saddened her mother and saddened her father the most was that she'd given up on church. She'd quit going to church. Her dad sat in my office one day, tears just running down his face. And he told me about Cindy. I already knew Cindy, met her, beautiful young lady. He said, she told me she wasn't going to church, and he said, I knew it, and I told her that she needed to be in church. That God would help her get through it, that God would see her through it. And he said, she looked at me and she said, Daddy, she said, I got a lot of things to figure out. And once I get them figured out, I'll get back in church and I'll get back with God. But until then, I'm going to do this alone. He cried, he begged her, he pled with her to no avail. Like I say, I haven't talked to them in quite a while, but I know the last time I talked to them, she had never come back. You know who she had put her faith in? Herself. She hadn't put her faith in God. I've got to find the answers, and I've got to find them within me. Well, that's the wrong place to look. Oh, it's good to turn inward and to look at ourselves, but all the time trust in God. Some trust in horses, some in chariots. The psalmist said in Psalm 20 and verse 7, but we will trust in the living God. God's our rock, our fortress, our deliverer. Psalm 18. He's our higher tower. Trust in the Lord with all your heart. Lean not upon your own understanding. In all your ways acknowledgement, and he shall bring it to pass. Proverbs 3, verse 5. Oh, we could use a whole bunch of them. But the idea is learn to trust in God. Trusting in his strength. Trusting in his care. Trusting in his power. Trusting in his providence. Trusting in his love. He'll get us through. We may not like those ideas, but he's promised us. And a God that cannot lie has promised us that while we may suffer great afflictions, while we may go through terrible times, our light afflictions are but for a moment. That work in us a far more exceeding and eternal weight of glory, while we look not on the things that are seen, but the things that are unseen. The things that are seen, they're temporal, but the things that are unseen, they're eternal. We realize that we have not a tabernacle or tent made with hands, but we have a permanent place, a home made with God, made by God. And so we trust in Him because He's the one. He will give us what we need. But we have to trust. And so what does that mean? Well, that means we really have to open up our hearts, we have to open up our lives, and we just simply have to say, God, it's in your hands. Now, folks, this is an important principle. And I know you know that it is. I mean, why else would you be at church on Sunday night? But it's a tremendously important principle that leads us into our subject of prayer and prayer ministry next month. To learn to say, okay, I've done all that I can do. I've done my part. God, here, I lay it at your feet. And I trust you that you'll take care of it. You'll do for me what is best. And so if you're given one more day, trust in God. But if you're also given one more day, give God the glory. Paul had to give God the glory. Paul did. Paul was the one that glorified God. We have to learn to give God the glory. The Ark of the Covenant in the book of 1 Chronicles is what I'm going to reference. The Ark of the Covenant had been sort of given away almost, taken away. And the children of Israel had gained it again, but it was not where it needed to be. By the time you get to 1 Chronicles 15 and 1 Chronicles 16, the ark is brought back and it is put into the tabernacle. The temple at the time had not been built. David offers a prayer of praise and thanksgiving for it being placed finally back where it needed to be placed. And he talks about great is the God. And he talks about glorifying God. Give to the Lord glory. What a great thought. To give God the praise for the day. To give God the praise for what goes on in your life. We need to be sure that we credit God with what is ours. That we credit God because of what He's done for us. And so David says, give unto the Lord the glory that is due Him. Bring an offering and come before the Lord with praise. When you're given a new day, glorify God. Thank Him. Praise Him. Praise Him for His greatness. Praise Him for His majesty. Praise Him for His power. Praise Him for His strength. Praise Him for He's in your life. And just as much as you want to hold to Him, He wants to hold to you. Every day is not a great day. Some days are painful. Some days are hard. Some days the physical body is fine, but the old heart hurts. Some days the heart's good, but the physical body aches. Some days it's all good. It all balances out, you might say. The reality of it is if you're given a new day, you're given a new blessing. You're given a gift. You're given a rose by God. Take it and use it as you see fit. But be sure that God is the center of the day. This evening, if you're not a New Testament child of God, or you're one that needs to rededicate your life, our prayer is that you'll come while together we stand and sing.